Pamela Chrysler was born on March 16, 1953, in Albany, Georgia. She was raised in a large family and had always dreamed of helping others. After completing high school, she obtained a medical degree and began working as a counselor specializing in mental health and substance abuse. Later, Pamela transitioned into private practice and eventually opened her own office. Over time, she continued dedicating herself to helping people, and many of her clients greatly appreciated the part she played in their recovery. In 2002, at the age of 49, Pamela decided to relocate to a new city, Athens, also in Georgia. She wanted to expand her business and continued her work after moving. At that point, Pamela wasn't married and didn't have any children. Most of her life had revolved around her career, helping others, and supporting her family whenever possible. On August 21, 2002, residents of an apartment complex located on the outskirts of town reported a foul odor coming from one of the buildings. The staff went to investigate, and quickly tracked the smell to Unit 408. When no one answered the door, they used a spare key to enter. But the instant they opened the door, they were confronted with a horrifying sight: a body lying on the living room floor. They immediately contacted the police. When officers arrived, they discovered the body of a woman, but there were no documents anywhere in the apartment to identify her. She was wearing only underwear, which led detectives to suspect sexual assault as a possible motive. However, one detail stood out: someone had covered her with a sheet, which seemed unusual. They also noticed that there were no signs of forced entry at the front door. Yet, the balcony door had been left slightly open, leading investigators to suspect the killer might have entered through there. While the medical examiners examined the body, crime scene investigators combed through the apartment for evidence. The living room was spattered with blood, but tests later confirmed that all of it belonged to the victim. Still, amid all that chaos, they discovered one crucial piece of evidence: a single drop of someone else's blood on a newspaper resting on the kitchen counter. Tests verified that it came from a man, but there was no match found in the DNA database. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been stabbed over 20 times. She also bore numerous defensive wounds, indicating she had fought back fiercely during the attack. However, there were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out the detectives' initial theory. The first priority for investigators was to determine the identity of the victim, so they went to speak with the building manager. To their surprise, he informed them that the apartment was rented by a man named Richard, who, as far as anyone knew, lived there alone. Detectives began trying to locate him, and before long, they managed to reach him by phone. Richard explained that he had been in Florida on a work trip for the past few weeks. He also identified the victim. It was Pamela Chrysler. According to him, they had met not long ago and gone on a date, but nothing romantic had developed between them. However, they stayed in touch as friends, and when Richard had to leave town, he offered to let Pamela stay at his apartment for free while he was away. He said it made him feel more at ease knowing someone was watching over the place. Richard also mentioned that they had been talking on the phone every day until 4 days earlier, when she suddenly stopped answering. He thought it was strange but assumed she was just busy and didn't think much of it. From their very first conversation with Richard, detectives started noticing some red flags. For one, the idea that he would allow a woman he barely knew to live in his apartment seemed unusual. On top of that, during their call, Richard brought up that Pamela used to sleep with the balcony door slightly open, a detail that made investigators raise their eyebrows. They had not shared that information publicly, but they already suspected the killer had entered through that exact door. So, why did Richard mention that specific detail out of nowhere? Shortly after speaking with the police, Richard began heading back home. But on the way, he called the apartment manager and made an odd request. He asked him to cut out the section of carpet where the bloodstain had been found, claiming he wanted to take the sample to a lab himself for testing. The manager thought the request was so strange that he immediately reported it to detectives. Once Richard returned, police brought him in for questioning, and throughout the interview, he continued behaving oddly. As for his out-of-town alibi, investigators were not quick to believe it. According to the medical examiner, the body had been in the apartment for several days, meaning Richard could have committed the murder and then left town right afterward. However, during the interview, Richard provided strong evidence that he had been in Florida well before the murder took place. He also gave detectives the names of coworkers and other people who could verify his whereabouts. After speaking with those individuals, police confirmed that Richard had indeed been out of state, and it seemed very unlikely that he could have committed the crime. In addition, forensic experts compared his DNA to the drop of blood found on the newspaper, and it did not match. So, despite his strange behavior, detectives removed Richard from their list of suspects and continued searching for new leads. Given Pamela's work with clients struggling with mental health and addiction, detectives started to wonder whether one of them could have been responsible for the attack. They began investigating each of her clients, but that line of inquiry led nowhere. Still, while trying to determine a motive, they also considered the possibility that it had been a robbery gone wrong. Pamela's apartment was on the ground floor, and she often left her balcony door slightly open. That alone might have tempted a random thief to break in. They asked Richard to look through the apartment and let them know if anything valuable appeared to be missing. He carefully checked around and said that, as far as he could tell, everything was still there, except for one item, a large vacuum cleaner. To police, that was yet another strange detail. Why would a killer go through the trouble of carrying off a bulky, inexpensive vacuum cleaner while leaving everything else untouched? Still, detectives decided to check local pawn shops, hoping the killer might have tried to sell it. That theory paid off quickly. At one of the shops, officers located Richard's vacuum. But there was a catch. The store had no surveillance cameras inside or outside. The only lead available was the employee who had been working that day. He remembered a young man, probably around 20 years old, coming in with the vacuum. Unfortunately, that was as far as it went. Every attempt to track down the man led nowhere, and once again, detectives were left with nothing. A few days later, once Richard was cleared to return to his apartment, he began talking with his neighbors. He asked if anyone had seen someone removing a vacuum from his place before Pamela's death. Police had already considered that the vacuum incident might have been unrelated, that it could have been stolen earlier, and Pamela simply hadn't noticed. But then Richard heard something interesting. One of his neighbors said she'd had trouble sleeping the night of the murder. At one point, she heard noise in the hallway and looked through her peephole. That's when she saw a young man, someone she didn't recognize, rolling a vacuum cleaner out of Richard's apartment. At first, she thought about opening the door to offer help, but just as she reached for the handle, something fell off. She hesitated and decided to stay quiet. As she continued watching through the peephole, she happened to open a soda can she'd been holding the entire time. The sound was loud enough that the man froze and stared directly at her door. He stood there for a few seconds, then grabbed the vacuum, shut the door behind him, and disappeared. Detectives were both surprised and a bit frustrated that the woman had waited weeks to share such crucial information. She insisted it had simply slipped her mind and that, at the time, she hadn't even thought the man could have been the killer. Once they had her statement, police worked with her to create a composite sketch of the suspect. When they showed it to the pawn shop employee, he confirmed that the man in the sketch strongly resembled the person who had brought in the vacuum. Detectives released the sketch to newspapers and television stations, hoping someone would recognize him. But no helpful tips ever came in. They kept searching for other leads that might help identify the suspect, but nothing worked out. Eventually, the case went cold because detectives had nothing solid to go on. Over the years, the file was reopened multiple times, but each time, it led straight to a dead end. That's how things remained for 15 years. Then, out of nowhere, the case took an unexpected turn. Detectives were informed that a new DNA profile had been uploaded to the FBI's database, and it matched the drop of blood found at the crime scene. It belonged to a 30-year-old man named Abdus LaRoche. His name had never once come up in Pamela's investigation, but he had crossed paths with law enforcement before, though not as a suspect. When LaRoche was a child, his parents joined a religious cult led by a man named Dwight York. York was infamous for constructing a massive compound in Georgia for his followers, complete with an Egyptian-style pyramid and sphinx. he attracted hundreds of people there until several children, including LaRoche, came forward and accused him of serious crimes. Along with those accusations, York faced numerous other charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and tax fraud. In the end, he was sentenced to 135 years in prison. Years later, when LaRoche was 24, he admitted that his testimony had been fabricated. But that confession didn't result in a retrial. As for LaRoche himself, he was never charged with anything, since he had been just a child when he made that statement. What truly surprised detectives was how LaRoche's DNA ended up in the system in the first place. He had been arrested for selling bootleg movie DVDs and was given probation. Not long after, he was pulled over by a patrol officer who found a small bag of illegal substances on him. Because he was still on probation, LaRoche was arrested again, and this time, a DNA sample was collected. As soon as it entered the database, detectives saw the match to Pamela's case. With this long-awaited lead, they began digging into LaRoche's past and were stunned to discover that, at the time of the murder, he had been living in the same apartment complex as Pamela, just in a different building. He had been 16 years old back then, and detectives had never spoken to him. Digging further, they managed to locate his old high school yearbook and compared a photo of LaRoche as a teenager to the composite sketch created from the neighbor's description. The resemblance was remarkable. Now that detectives had a DNA match, they brought LaRoche in for questioning. At first, they kept things casual, telling him they were simply following up with former residents of the complex who hadn't been interviewed back in 2002. They asked whether he had ever been inside the victim's apartment, and he said no. But then they told him about the DNA evidence, his blood found at the scene. That's when LaRoche changed his story. He claimed Pamela had once paid him $40 to take out some trash from her apartment. Detectives pointed out that this didn't explain how his blood ended up on the kitchen counter. So, he changed his story again, this time saying he had discovered her body, panicked, and fled. Shortly after, he altered his version once more, now claiming that he and Pamela had been in a romantic relationship, despite her being 33 years older than him. Detectives knew LaRoche was grasping at straws to avoid responsibility, but with a DNA match, they didn't need a confession. Still, they had to follow proper procedures before making an arrest. They obtained a warrant to collect a fresh DNA sample and sent it to the lab for final confirmation. While they waited for the results, the case took yet another unexpected turn. LaRoche's own brother contacted the FBI tip line, stating that years earlier, LaRoche had confessed to being the one who killed Pamela. According to his brother, LaRoche had told him that he had broken into Pamela's apartment during the night intending to steal something. But while he was inside, she woke up and caught him, so he grabbed a knife and attacked her. Now detectives had more than just a DNA match. They had a statement from LaRoche's own brother. Once the lab officially confirmed that the blood at the scene belonged to LaRoche, he was arrested, and prosecutors began preparing for trial. LaRoche continued to insist that he was innocent, and the prosecutors soon realized that the case might not be as straightforward as it seemed. At the time of the murder, LaRoche had been only 16 years old, and the only physical evidence linking him to the scene was a single drop of blood. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no other physical evidence to support the charge. So yes, it was possible that a jury might decide that wasn't enough. Because of that, prosecutors offered LaRoche a plea deal. If he pled guilty to manslaughter and the theft of the vacuum, they would remove life imprisonment and the death penalty from consideration. He accepted almost immediately, signed a confession, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He will be eligible for release in 2038, when he turns 52. After that, he will remain under supervision for another 20 years, and if he commits even a minor offense, he will be sent straight back to prison. Pamela's family was stunned when detectives informed them about the arrest. For 15 years, they had believed the case would never be solved, that they would never learn the truth about what had happened. But in the end, LaRoche, who had managed to slip through the cracks for so long, was caught over something as small as selling bootleg DVDs. If you found this case intriguing, make sure to like and subscribe. We upload new crime case videos every night. Stay tuned, and brace yourself for what's coming next.